Our Bible word is Luke 9, verses 29 to 31. As he prayed, the appearance of his face was altered, and his robe became white and glistening. And behold, two men talked with him, who were Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his decease, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. So, this is the account of Jesus' transfiguration. And this we find in the three synoptic gospels. And the synoptic gospels, it's the gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they are seen together. That's what the word synopsis means. And so our account here forms part of the triple tradition. So you'll find this in all three of the synoptic gospels, because this is also based on the theory that Mark was the first gospel, and about 500 of his verses were taken or copied into Matthew, and about 350 then were taken over by Luke. So this account is those 350 verses that Luke took from Mark's gospel. So the issue here is, who is Jesus? Because just before our present pericope, Jesus was with his disciples, and then he asked them, who do the people say I am? And then Simon Peter, of course, confessed, you are the Christ of God. In other words, the Messiah of God. So the Messiah would be understood as a mighty leader, normally a military type guy. He would bring victory, he will bring honor, he will bring prestige, also to his followers. But now, Jesus is also in that way misunderstood, because he's not that type of Messiah. Because Jesus then goes on and has something shocking to say. It explains what type of Messiah he is. If you go to chapter 9, verses 22, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised the third day. The Messiah is going to be killed? For the average Jew of the first century, that just sounds ridiculous. I mean, the Messiah brings victory over the enemies. There's not this humiliation to be killed. So Jesus develops this understanding of his disciples, but they still don't get who Jesus is. Because this suffering Jesus also has consequences for you as his follower. It won't bring prestige and victory. If we carry on, it says there in verse 23, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. So the meaning here is breaking with the family. Because the family will shun you because you become a follower of Jesus. In that sense, you pick up your cross, you follow Jesus. It's a way of shame, it's a way of rejection. So that's what it actually means to follow Jesus, the Messiah or the Christ. It's not as was expected normally. And now Jesus also goes on to say, just before our present pericope, he says, but I tell you truly, there are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the kingdom of God. So Jesus is also going to reveal, it might be this Messiah is going to be killed. It's a way of suffering, humiliation. But then the people or his disciples is going to get some insight into who he actually is as this funny Messiah, this Messiah nobody expected, but they will see his glory a little bit. Also to try and influence their understanding in terms of who's Jesus, what's his identity. Now then we come to our present pericope, which is the transfiguration, and that's from verses 28 to 36. It's about, again, changing the perception of the disciples in terms of who Jesus really is. If we go to our Bible or our passage from verse 28, it says there, so this connects with the previous verse where Jesus says, there are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the kingdom of God. And now we come to our pericope where it starts. Now it came to pass about 8 days after these sayings. So they are connected. So the kingdom of God that Jesus spoke of, that will be revealed, is now something like that's going to happen now. So he took Peter, John, and James and went up on the mountain to pray. So Peter, James, and John, early in the account, they went with Jesus where he raised Jairus' daughter. So a very intimate, close relationship or circle of followers of Jesus. So they go up to this mountain with Jesus to pray. And by tradition, it's the Mount Tabor there in Galilee. So they ascend up this mountain for Jesus to pray. And this is also a very unique feature of Luke's gospel, the prayer life of Jesus. Repeatedly mention is made of Jesus praying. And of course, Jesus also gives a lot of teaching about prayer. So here was Jesus, he's praying on the top of this mountain. And then we come to our Bible word. As he prayed, the appearance of his face was altered, and his robe became white and glistening. And behold, 2 men talked with him, who were Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his decease, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. So, of course, when it was asked who was Jesus, then the disciples answered, well, some said you Elijah or the prophet, whatever, but yet also it's made clear Jesus is not Elijah, but he was something like Elijah, being a prophet. And of course, there's also Moses, but Jesus is also a kind of Moses because he's the leader of the new Exodus. But obviously, Jesus is far above Elijah or Moses. Because Elijah represents the prophets. Moses he was the big prophet of Israel, but he also represents the law. And here they are conversing with Jesus about his departure, Exodus, or our Bible word says decease that will occur in Jerusalem. So here's 2 people from the realm of the departed having a conversation with Jesus, and they appear in glory, our Bible word says. And what is this decease or departure of Jesus? Of course, it refers to his rejection, his crucifixion, but also his resurrection and exaltation that will happen. But more significantly also is that the disciples see who Jesus is, his true identity, because he's transformed. He becomes white. It's something indescribable that they see in Jesus because he's transfigured. His face shines. His clothes become a brilliant white. So they see with their own eyes the kingdom of God. In other words, the identity of Jesus and also eventually those who will become his followers. So they have this, what's called this proleptic vision. In other words, who Jesus is and of course what he will be after his resurrection. So their understanding is not there yet, but they see now with their eyes, whoa, this is Jesus. And our Bible word also says that they enter a cloud. And the cloud is symbolic for God's divine presence. Of course, Peter also, it says the disciples were half sleepy. They wake up and Peter says, let's build 3 tabernacles. He doesn't really know what he's saying. But then they enter this cloud and now that's the divine presence. And they hear God's voice speaking to them. So they see who Jesus is and now they can also hear God's voice telling them who Jesus is. And if we go to verse 35, and a voice came out of the cloud saying, this is my beloved Son, hear him. The New King James Bible, it's based on a certain textual tradition, but if you actually go to earlier manuscripts, it says something like this. This is my Son, my chosen one, listen to him. So there are 3 things that God is communicating to the disciples who Jesus is. They see Jesus, of course, in his glorified state. So what does that mean? Firstly, God identifies Jesus in 3 ways. He is the Son of God. And of course, Jesus was already identified as such earlier in the gospel. This was news or information the disciples did not really have previously. But now it's made clear to them for the first time. Jesus is, number 1, the Son of God. Number 2, he's this servant of Isaiah. If you go to Isaiah, there are these 4 servant songs that speaks of the servant figure. And specifically what's relevant to us here, go read Isaiah 42 verses 1 to 7. Because there in Isaiah 42 verse 1, it speaks of the servant as the chosen one. So it identifies Jesus as the servant of Isaiah. And this servant, if you go read Isaiah, he leads God's people. He also suffers death and humiliation. He dies as a sacrifice of atonement for people's sins, but also he will be vindicated. So here God identifies Jesus. He is the servant of Isaiah, being this chosen one. And thirdly, Jesus is this prophet like Moses. If you go to Deuteronomy 18 verses 15, which corresponds to that thing, listen to him. In Deuteronomy, God says, I will raise a prophet from among your brethren, and you must listen to him. So here God says, listen to him. Jesus is this prophet like Moses, the eschatological prophet. In other words, the prophet of the end time. So, this is what happens on the Mount of Transfiguration. The disciples see who Jesus is, with his appearance being transfigured. There he talks with souls from the departed about what he will do in Jerusalem, the salvation that he will establish. Then God tells his disciples also who Jesus is, the Son of God, the servant of Isaiah, and also that he is the prophet like Moses.